to turn it over now to Jen Watkins at the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to the Climate Impacts Group for letting me be a part of this important celebration tonight. I have had the great fortune of working alongside several Climate Impacts Group scientists in the Cascadia Partner Forum. That's a group that was formed in 2012 by natural resource practitioners on both sides of the border in Washington and British Columbia that simply realized we needed to work together across traditional boundaries of land ownership and international borders to facilitate and build the adaptive capacity of our shared landscape and the species living within it. And tonight, when I was asked to provide a story about wildlife and resilience, I thought I'd just actually tell a story of where I saw the ethos of the Climate Impacts Group of applied science really play out and offer hope and teach me some lessons along the way about resilience. I'm going to move a little further south than Jason in the Cascades and also talk about a project that really aimed to have progress for all of these species we're looking at on the screen. From that charming pika holding a whole lot of grass in its mouth to the Canada lynx, moving so smooth with those snowshoes for feet across the snow, to the Pacific giant salamander and the elk. And next slide. We have had scientists, and in this case with the map that you're viewing here, the University of Washington and the Nature Conservancy help us understand that when we think about the climate impacts that are going to be coming at us, at a continental scale, we know that wildlife need to move. And with a graphic as beautiful as this, we've even begun to understand the broad patterns of how they move. But next slide. We're even more fortunate in Washington, on the next slide, to have the climate impacts. Nope, oh, sorry, previous slide, it just moved a little slow. In Washington, we're even more fortunate to have scientists like the Climate Impacts Group, as well as the co-production of collaborative scientific bodies like the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group and the Cascadia Partner Forum, where we take that continental level science, the huge science of climate change at the scale it's happening, and it gets drilled down to something we know how to act on here in Washington. And so the text on this slide, it is verbatim pulled from a Climate Impacts Group report that actually synthesized all of the science about how climate is going to impact our species and helps us understand that idea that they need to have those options for movement. Also on this slide is one of the many maps created from the Connectivity Working Group where we not only know that wildlife need to move, scientists began to map for us to help us visualize how and where are they moving, where is the best available habitat, and what is the resistance for how they move between that habitat. So not only do we have a way to anticipate that, but for people like myself who've been in the nonprofit community and now in a state agency, I can understand where I can invest and act to facilitate those changes today and over time. And my story today is going to start in the blue area, right there in the central Cascades, about an hour east of Seattle, where it's that connective tissue between all that green, wonderful habitat in the Cascades. So the next slide. About 20 years ago, when Sig was about 5 years old, I began working in the Cascades in the landscape just east of Snoqualmie Pass along I-90. And when you get this bird's eye view that we're looking at here of Snoqualmie Pass, the Cascades seem wild and rugged. The habitat seems intact, but even there, you see this ribbon of an interstate that acts as a bit of a barrier for wildlife. So we know that something's breaking up that habitat. And next slide. When we step down from that bird's eye view to the view that an animal actually gets adjacent to I-90, this is a photo that the Department of Transportation actually took of an elk viewing freight moving across I-90. That's where we see that ribbon that we saw at another level actually acts as a huge barrier for wildlife having that ability to move. And the good news for this elk and many of the other species, including those I showed on that first slide, is that over the past 2 decades, a remarkable story has unfolded, where a highway that acted as a barrier for wildlife movement is undergoing profound change to improve east-west connections for people, like all of us on the line here, to move in our cars across Washington. It's also improving those connections for wildlife, including this elk, to move north-south in the Cascades. I entered this story about 20 years ago, right as I was leaving college. And I learned a few things along the way. not only about how we can work together to increase resiliency for ecosystems and wildlife like we're viewing here, but also how we can increase some of our own resiliency in doing this work. Because when I say something has taken 20 years, it takes a while to do this work, and we all need to stay in it. So we need to make sure that we can keep ourselves resilient. Next slide. The first lesson I learned, which can seem kind of ridiculous, is that when we talk about climate change, the issues are huge, and the solutions we need to come up with have to be equally huge. And so on one side of the screen, we're looking at the wildlife overpass that actually has been constructed and is currently being planted over Interstate 90, which is a tremendous, big structure to help wildlife move. But one of the coolest things I found is that when we're dealing with these big issues, we have to remember that we bring along and think about the smallest of our creatures. The little ones have to be thought about. But at the same time, we have to find wonder. And for me, that ended up happening in some of the smallest creatures we thought about for this overpass. Right here is the dromedary jumping slug. This fascinating creature carries all of its internal organs in that backpack it's actually carrying. And when it actually gets disturbed by a predator, it does its signature move that it's named after by just kind of jumping and flipping itself. And so while dealing with all the decades of thinking about how do we plan for this wildlife overpass, what do? We ended up looking at what species we were building it for. And when we found this jumping slug, I found myself in awe of the evolution that this thing even exists in the forest that we live by, that something actually carries all of its organs on its back and survives in this world. And it turned out with research that a lot of species about this size and small amphibians, they don't just cross that overpass in a matter of minutes like an elk does. They'll end up living on that overpass. And so it makes you think differently about the solutions that we create. So I guess lesson number one, remembering that we've got to solve things for everybody. We've got to solve them even for the smallest of creatures. And we can't forget to find a little bit of wonder and awe along the way. Next slide. The other thing I learned in the I-90 project, and right here we're looking at one of the underpasses that was built at Townsend Creek. There's a whole series of them that were built on Interstate 90. The thing I learned is how quickly wildlife will respond. There's that famous Hollywood line, build it and they will come. And we saw that in I-90. Here at Townsend Creek, we ended up seeing bull trout respond nearly immediately once that structure was opened and the flow started happening for that creek. They had returned into tributaries they hadn't been in decades. They had been cut off in the original construction of I-90. And immediately upon opening, when you thought that sedimentation or other issues might prevent them from coming in, these curious creatures came in right away. Also on this slide, we're looking at a Chinook salmon. These salmon had that same response. And while we were monitoring, we were able to actually put tags on them, the scientists at Central Washington University. And with those tags, we were able to see them leave the tributaries right there at Snoqualmie Pass and travel over 130 miles past the John Day Dam out to the ocean. And so watching their response, knowing how rapidly that if we offer them options, when we decide to do the right thing and change this landscape and give wildlife a chance, they will respond. Next slide. And it's not just the fish and the little ones. These are elk. This was just a month ago of elk. You'd hardly know it, but they're standing right on top of I-90 on that overpass. And to me, I'm looking at two of them that appear to be having a pretty good time, and none of them appear to be stressed about the traffic underneath them. And as you'll notice, this is before the forest even begins to really regrow on that overpass. And so right as that overpass was built, even while construction equipment was up there, they saw that deer were beginning to bed right next to the construction equipment. And some of the guys who are coming in for that construction the next day were getting photos on their phone. And now as the equipment is left, we're seeing entire herds of elk moving over I-90 and taking their time in doing it. So lesson number two, wildlife will respond and it'll happen quickly if we just offer them the chance. Next slide. One thing that really stood out to me in the I-90 project is that while we as professionals who had studied not only wildlife and all of the ecosystems that we were trying to connect, but getting together with the engineers who had studied for years how you actually make rebar and concrete, produce the kinds of structures we were discussing, we felt like we were pretty on groundbreaking turf thinking about these wildlife overpasses. And as we began to reach out to elementary and middle and high school students throughout Washington about this project, they got it a lot quicker than we did. And it made sense to them a lot quicker than it did to us. And so I guess the next lesson I just wanted to share is the power of the next generation coming up under us, how quickly they're understanding the issues of climate, how quickly they think of creative and large-scale solutions to solve this, and the level of inspiration they've got behind this. It gave me a hope as much as the actual construction itself did and the wildlife response. And so right here, we're viewing not only some of the artwork they did, that's actually some of the constructions they did of how if they built an overpass, what they would include in it. And some of them were novel ideas I hope we see in our next connectivity structures in Washington. Next slide. This slide is just a reminder. This is myself standing on the overpass right after it had been constructed with a colleague from the U.S. Forest Service. And it's a reminder to me that although we may be designing these and the idea and thinking about species and their needs, none of this happens without people. People who are willing to think a little bigger, to stand their ground, to put out bold ideas that may seem a little crazy at first. And the woman in this photo, Patty Garvidarda, she put out a lot of big ideas alongside other colleagues for the I-90 project before anybody thought they were logical. Her first idea was actually to just build one big bridge for the entire 15 miles so that no animal had to worry about anything. They just walk underneath it. And after she kind of got crickets from a lot of the engineers about how impossible and expensive that would be, she backed up to ideas that still seem bold but are becoming reality in front of our eyes. And so I just think the relationships that we build, whether in practice or in our areas like the Cascadia Partner Forum, they matter because it's the people and the relationships we're going to need to get the resilient work we need on the ground done. Next slide. And my final lesson in all of it is, although the I-90 story was an amazing one to be a part of for myself, it was a chapter. And as we think about doing resilient work here in Washington and throughout the region, it's a long haul of a story. And there's always another chapter to be a part of, and there is also a lot of roles to play. And so for myself, a year and a half ago, I moved to the Department of Natural Resources from my previous nonprofit job. And while I stepped away from working directly on I-90, although I got to maintain my engagement in a lot of the exciting regional bodies like the Cascadia Partner Forum, I ended up working for an agency where I get to work on the forests and their resiliency immediately adjacent to I-90 and think about how that habitat can actually act as a healthy feeder habitat on either side of these crossing structures and then connected to these wilder places like Jason was talking about at North Cascades National Park. And so I just close saying, I think there is a lot of hope that has been done out there. And I find myself excited not only about the stories that we've completed together on the landscape and how wildlife are already responding, but the stories we have yet to tell and how much more work there is to be done. Thank you for having me tonight.